The title of my talk tonight is Mad Cows Meeting. You all know that I regard these meetings as a kind of a family reunion. I think that we should have fun and sparkle, we should have brightness, and we should above all have Bill, who is absolutely as crucial to these meetings almost as walk in itself. But they're supposed to be convivial, they have the atmosphere of a reunion. We like to barrack each other from the floor from time to time. Feel free to do that. I notice nobody's done it yet. I wanted to barrack Walter this morning when he gave his introductory remarks and asked him that since he's been proved wrong so many times by the authorities, why hasn't he just given up the ghost altogether? But he wisely didn't have a question and answer session at the end, because I think it was very prudent of him to say that. But on this occasion, since a hallmark of these evenings is that every year is as big a surprise to you as it is to me. Sometimes they're serious and sometimes not. Sometimes they are excessively multimedia, sometimes they aren't. But this year is actually a serious one. It is not light-hearted. There aren't jokes one can make about it. It points up lessons which I hope we can learn in science. And it points up changes, some of which I'll refer to in a talk I'm going to give in one of the technical sessions a little later, about the way in which as microscopists we may have to deal with vast, new and intractable problems in the future, which belie the experiences we may have gained in the past. I'm going to talk to you tonight about what is popularly known as mad cow disease. It is officially known as Bovine spongiform encephalopathy. It is not the first spongiform encephalopathy. It is not going to be the last. But it is a disease which has already cost the British agricultural industry and big business large amounts of money. It has now begun to cost human lives, and it is only by the grace of God that it is not already affecting Americans. My own belief is that it is a perfectly clear chance that it may yet. I'm not being scaremongering when I say that, and I'll explain my views a little later. BSE, Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, first appeared in 1986. In the spring of that year, a veterinary surgeon, Colin Whitaker, of Ashford in Kent, went to see a client, a farmer, who had problems with a cow. The cow had the staggers, and those of you who come from farming backgrounds know that the staggers is a fairly regular disease of cattle. They stumble on their feet, they can't maintain their normal walking posture, and it's caused by a lack of magnesium. Sometimes the disease is caused by animals being turned out on the spring pasture, because spring fast-growing grass contains low levels of magnesium, and it is a nervous disease, which is ultimately. It is also found in sheep. Sheep sometimes develop kale disease, as it's called, because if they eat spring kale, it contains low levels of magnesium, they also get ill. It's cured instantly by giving a magnesium supplement, and the animal at once becomes well within days, hours. Whitaker found that when he gave the injection of magnesium, the cow looked a little more alert, and he went on his way quite happily, rather surprised that the cow hadn't got up again. He was later called back to find that the cow was still staggering around. It was acting as though it was wildly apprehensive. It didn't like humans coming near it. It began to attack the farmer who raised it, and to whom normally this cow was extremely well disposed. And in the end, he had the cow put down. Like a wise veterinarian, he had histology done on the brain, and he found that the neurons had developed macro, that the brain had developed a macroscopic, spongy appearance. And his immediate thought was how like this was, how similar this was to scraping in sheep. The tissue samples went to the Central Veterinary Laboratory in Weybridge in Surrey, where further research was done. And after some more cases began to come to light, it was clear to them that we had a new disease, a a disease known as Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which as soon as the press came across it, they immediately dubbed mad cow disease. The other spongiform encephalopathies are already well known. Scrapie was first described in 1759 by a German doctor named Leopold. He described it very accurately. His symptomatology was exactly correct. He advised that the sheep should be dispatched humanely, that its remains should not be allowed to become mixed with the feed for other sheep, which often happens, that placental material, for example, should be buried. It's often consumed by sheep. Although we believe these animals are obligate herbivores, many of them eat meat, it's quite common for sheep to eat placenta for the obvious reason that a wandering predator like a fox or a wolf finding placenta will know that there is newborn young nearby. And you can often see herbivorous animals nibbling away at the occasional bits of animal remains. Scrapie has many different strains, and all of them present in slightly different symptoms. And the name that Scrapie has in different countries reflects the disease. It's known as the trotting sickness in Germany. It's known as la tremblance, the trembling disease in France. Out in the flocks of sheep on Iceland, it has more of a behavioural abnormality. The names it has there are related to the fact that the sheep become unfriendly towards the shepherd. Now, there are spongiform diseases also of humans. The most interesting one is a disease called Kuru, which is found in Papua New Guinea amongst the foreign people of the Eastern Highlands of that nation. Kuru was discussed and described very accurately by an American named Gaduchev, who, so long as nobody is recording this, is at the moment being investigated by the federal police for committing acts of sodomy against teenage boys. That's not as unexpected as it may seem. In Indonesia and in Papua New Guinea, it is quite common to find homosexual groups of young sexually active individuals living together. And young teenage and early 20s young men do live together and indulge in anal sex and mutual masturbation. And Gaduchev, who seems to have had activities in that general direction, found himself completely at home when he went there and decided to go native and live amongst the tribal people. Sadly, the American authorities don't take quite such a liberal view of that kind of self-expression, and for that reason he is at the moment in potentially very big trouble. I alluded to his activities in my book on DSE. For very obvious reasons of litigation, I couldn't say exactly what it was I'd been told by his co-workers and his friends, but I merely said in the book that many of his activities amongst the young men of the foreign tribe attracted official disapproval, and for that reason he was obliged to return to America. That way, everybody who doesn't know will be perfectly happy with the description that actually as far as it goes, and those who do know will wink quietly to themselves, satisfied with the knowledge that I do too. Gaduchev studied the conditions throughout the 1950s. He sent back illicitly and against official approval. He sent back brain specimens in large numbers. And he is the guy who recognized the point of similarity between Kuru and Scrapie. Indeed, in 1967 he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine jointly for that very important piece of work. Kuru is spread by cannibalism. It is often said Kuru is caused by cannibalism, but experienced by crossbreeds know the error of that kind of statement. It is spread by cannibalism, we do not know, however, what caused it. The foreign people, when their elders die, they often die at old age in their 40s. When their elders die, they remove the brain, and as a mark of ultimate homage, they pass it round buffet style for consumption, and the women often rub it into the skin, anointing it on their breasts, and in that way perpetuate the soul and spirit of the newly departed. They perpetuate Kuru into the bargain, and during the height of the epidemics in the 1950s, 1% of the population died every year. Kuru, however, is confined to that tribe and confined to those practices, and became much rarer when cannabis was outlawed about 1960. There are beliefs, however, unpublished beliefs, but I have it on high authority, that Kuru may actually be in the resurgence at the moment. Perhaps beginning, because, as in the case of many other native peoples, the foreign tribes seek to reassert their tribal identity and their cultural ways, and there is a belief that hidden cannibalism is now once again beginning to re-emerge, in which case the almost vanished disease is bound once more to spread. There is a disease which is international, the spongy-borne disease, and that is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, named after a Dr. Jakob, who in 1923 described one of these diseases in great detail, and then Professor Creutzfeldt, who was an Austrian neurologist, and he later discovered a number of other cases and wrote them up in detail, and some years later the condition was named after the two of them. And Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, occurs in about 1 in a million people throughout the world. It is a spongy-borne disease. Nobody knows where it comes from. It takes a year or two to kill people. It normally happens when you're in late middle age. And an obvious question was, can Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease be related to scabies? The answer appears to be no, because there are areas in the world, like the United States and England, where scabies is found, and there are areas like Australia and New Zealand where scabies is absent because of strict quarantine. But the level of CJD is the same in both sets, and so there is no epidemiological relationship between the incidence of scabies and the incidence of Creutzfeldt-Jakob. There is a much rarer genetic disease, Gerstmann-Straussler-Scheinber syndrome, GSSS, and this occurs in about 1 in 500 million. There's only a couple of cases per year. There is a disease called fatal familiar insomnia, which is also genetically determined. It occurs in about 1,000 million people. So there are only a couple of cases per decade. But these are all spongiform diseases of the human population. They're all well known, they're well documented, and we have studied them and known about them for some decades. Spongiform diseases are already found in the United States. You have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, you have Gerstmann-Straussler-Scheinber syndrome, you also have fatal familiar insomnia, and of course you have scabies. But what you have never had is an example of a disease in humans which is known to be caused by an infectious principle. And this leads us to the nature of the causative agent. Sometimes people speak of the virus of the spongiform diseases. It is not a virus. It is not a bacteria. What we have here, and it is a matter of fascination to all microscopists, I'm sure, what we have here is an entirely new form of disease-causing agent. It does not contain any genetic material. Viruses, as a rule, contain DNA, and those don't contain RNA. The causative agent of the spongiform diseases contains no genetic material whatever. It is a new form of infection. It must not be trapped into calling it a virus. I notice today that in the newly published Scientific American, they speak of the eradication of the smallpox bacterium rather than virus, which is quite a glaring mistake, I agree. And it's very tempting to speak about the agent of the spongiform diseases as a virus. It is not. It is something new, something that we cannot begin to comprehend. Now, let's look at the actual impact of this disease. That list reminds you of the extent to which beef is used as a vital raw material. It ain't just the meat. We use beef for large numbers of other products. The main cuts, of course, we all know about, but the high percentage of rich in collagen, and they're used to produce a whole host of byproducts. Hide, of course, through leather and all of the other products, is well known. The unusable part is used to make jewelry. Bones, in garden fertilizers, in pet food, are all ground up. Mechanically recovered meat. This is the meat protein, when everything has been stripped from the carcass, and the carcass is crushed under great weight, and a greyish, gelatinous, proteinaceous ooze comes from the bones. It's the interstitial cells, the tissues, and the tendons, the bony matrix of a proteinaceous nature. And that mechanically recovered meat, which is no more nor less aesthetically appealing than a piece of rump steak from the chicken, it all comes from the same creature. But the research for the extraction of the last ounce per carcass has been led by the hamburger industry in order to try and make cheap food. Beef extract, of course, is widely used in cooking. Milk needs no explanation. Lactose is widely used and extracted mainly from milk. Fat, of course, as tallow, has been a byproduct of the industry for a great many years. Fat was much in demand until the early 1980s, by which time other hydrolyzed fats have become fashionable and easily available, and so the use of fat from animal carcasses has become less commercial since the early 1980s. Glycerol, elastin, keratin, the amount of keratin which goes into cosmetic preparation nowadays, all comes. Oleo oil, stearic acid, stearin, and of course rennet, which is used in cheese making, quite apart from its use in food for making things like junkets and so on. Now, here are the landmark dates in BSE. 10 years ago the disease was first named. Until then it wasn't even known to exist. And it's interesting to note that I first was informed about it in 1986. I found it intriguing that my government chunks were at the outset saying never mention BSE and scrapie in the same breath. We don't want any connection between the two. And why that was I really don't know, unless they knew that the theory was going to be put about scrapie in sheep and sheep carcasses being fed to cattle that had caused BSE, and therefore they wanted to kill the scare before it started. As soon as they began to realise that scraping could not be related to human BSE epidemiologically, they immediately changed tack. Then when it became politically correct to associate the two. By 1988, Sir Richard Southwood, the eminent zoologist at the University of Oxford, was asked to chair an official government committee. In June of 88, BSE was made a notifiable disease. But they were still scrapping the carcasses. As a result, as soon as a farmer had a suspect cow, he didn't want any rights to eat cannabis. He sold it on the market to some unsuspecting purchaser, just as if you had a major problem just beginning to develop with your car, and you thought, I'll sell it quick before it gets worse. Not until 1988 were they even given 50% compensation. I said at that time, why don't you pay a premium to every farmer who brings in a case? A bottle of champagne, for example, or a £500 check. If you did that to farmers, then within 2 months, every known case would have been brought to the attention of the authorities. But as it was, they were still only getting 50% compensation. In my view, that encouraged farmers to sell off infected cattle. The following year, in 1989, the specified offer ban was introduced. And this meant that the brain, the spinal cord, the tonsils, the intestine, the thymus, and the spleen, the organs which is intestine, were all banned from being incorporated in human food. Now, although that went very well, and in 1990, the controls were made mandatory, and we actually had inspectors going round. We have shown, as late as December last year, 50% of slaughterhouses were not following the ban. And 2/3 of knackers yards who process scrap carcasses weren't following the ban. So there's very little point, really, in the government bleating about the fact that controls have been instituted if A, they are not being policed, and B, in consequence, they're not being observed. There is, though, no question about the Britishness of BSE. About 180,000 cases, 161,700 about my this table today, have been reported in Britain. 206 in Switzerland, 123 in Ireland, 31 in Portugal, and nil thus far in the United States. There still are no cases of BSE here. The reason that there are large numbers in Switzerland is because Switzerland has been a net importer of British feedstuffs, and we'll come to the possible cause in a moment, as has Ireland. The reason the numbers in France are rather low is because the French incur penalties for having infected cattle, and therefore farmers tend to bump off any dubious cow, dig a hole in the field, and bury it. In Britain and in Europe, the JCB is the brand of digger which is most widely used in France. And the French farmer said to a colleague of mine, "Monsieur, in France, BSE means JCB." And it is widely believed that the French have actually had a couple of hundred outbreaks. Now, the minute that this happened, there was a national sense of alarm. Everyone was grossly concerned. Because on March the 26th of this year, Stephen Dorrell, the Minister of Health and Commons, announced that 12 cases had been identified of a new form of spongiform encephalopathy in young humans. All of them hand-raising issues. Now, for 10 years, the government has been saying there is no chance of any risk whatever to humans. Keep eating the meat. All of us who are in microbiology knew that there was every reason to believe there might be a problem. But the government kept insisting there wasn't. And it wasn't until March they had to announce that there were 12 cases of a hitherto unknown disease. Now, that's occurred at the rate of 5 cases per year. And that means that in a population of, say, 50 million, that the actual chance is 1 in 5 million of getting it. And it struck me as being extraordinarily unfortunate if we were going to have a situation because of some new microbiological risk that everybody in Britain would be worried stiff about getting it, when in fact the chances are very tiny, because you then have the strange situation where the chance of getting the disease is only going to be 1 in 5 million. But we know the causal relationship between stress and strokes and coronaries and heart attacks and heaven knows what else. So you would actually have a far greater proportion of people getting ill through worry than you ever would have getting ill through the bees. And I found it quite instructive to put together what the risks actually are. And dying through being struck by lightning, as you can see, is 1 in 10 million. The beef risk is 1 in 5 million. Death in railway accidents is 1 in half million. And in fact, the dying in a road accident is 1 in 8,000. So you had a situation where the chances of death through driving to the supermarket and back to buy the beef were 1,000 times greater than the chance of dying through eating the beef when you got it home. Now, this is not in any way an excuse, but it is important to try and come to terms with the way that the public perceive risk. the fascination of beef is always based on perceptions of quality. And I know people who say, I always eat tenderloin, I always eat suicide. We all know the fillet steak, of course, is the toughest. I found it quite intriguing to actually research at the bottom there, in putting together my book on the subject, just what the tenderness of the various cuts happens to be. And if you'd all like to make a mental note, you can jot them down until the book gets published in extent, which won't happen unless you have cases over here. Then those are the actual tendernesses of the cuts of the beef. But the main thing I want to draw your attention to here is where beef is used in food. Because vegetarians don't eat red meat. There are sort of quasi-vegetarians who eat fish and poultry. But vegans, of course, don't eat anything, even milk, butter, whatever else. Indeed, a friend of mine in London is a vegan and belongs to a vegan group and was ostracized by them, and this is not a fake, for breastfeeding her newborn baby. They said, we do not feed animal milk to vegan children, and what you are doing is unacceptable. And she said to me, what on earth can I say? And I said, what you can say to me is that the reason that veganism exists is in order not to exploit animals. In this case, the mother is the only animal being exploited, and since she has consented, there is no actual exploitation. She ran off as happy as Danny could tell her friend, right? But just look at the places where beef products, mostly gelatin, actually occur. There are British beef products in licorice all sorts, which are coconut and licorice candy, in fruitful puddings, in Christmas pudding, in sweet mincemeat, and in pork pies. There is foreign beef products in wine glasses, in fromage bread, in Turkish delight, in pork pate and in marshmallows. There is no beef product of any kind in roast beef flavoured chips. In Britain, we make gravy with a brown powder and hot water, disto gravy. There is not a flicker, not a trace of any beef product in that beef gravy. There is none in that rich brown savoury spread. None. There isn't any in Campbell's meatballs or in Wolf There's no beef at all in Ginster's sausage rolls, and surprisingly there isn't any in fish paste. I half expected there to be some. So it's actually extremely difficult to avoid beef products. And I may say the publication of this table in my book caused some consternation. I did one chat show with a lady who was written a book about veganism. She was horrified to think that she had been so self-righteous for years about the fact she never had anything that came from animals, whereas in fact she had a penchant for licorice all sorts. The size of the problem is exemplified just by running, or I briefly, and I continue on to study that table, down the list of the countries that buy British beef. We don't buy American beef in Britain because it is not legal to import your contaminated food into Europe. American beef is produced with the aid of growth hormones, which are implanted with a little gun in the pellet in the back of the animal's neck, and it causes it to put on an extra 6 or 8% or so of extra meat. That is not believed to be safe in Europe, and as a result you are stuck with your beef, and you are not allowed to import it into the United Kingdom. A fact which I find immensely amusing, because I know how deeply proud Americans all are of their beef industry and of their massive consumption of hamburgers. I'm told that Oprah Winfrey on one of her shows said 6 weeks or so ago that having read about BSE in Britain, she was no longer going to eat hamburgers, and that caused a temporary dip in the graph. When I chaired a meeting on BSE in 1990, I had a team of speakers, government speakers and others, and they all said 1990 is the peak year for BSE. From now on it will die down. They said 1989, 1990, that really was the biggest year. time we looked at the figures for 1989, but as you can see, aged 4 was 2,000 cattle, aged 5 there were 1,800 cattle in Britain that had gone down with BSE. Now they made this statement in my meeting in 1990, so in 1991 I got out the figures to see whether they turned out to be right. As you can see, the number had gone from 2,000 to 7,000 for 4-year-old cattle, and from 1,200 to 4,600 in 5-year-old cattle. By April of this year, almost 60% of British dairy farms had had a case of BSE. Beef herds, the figure was 15%. The average number of cases in the spring of 95 was nearly 400. The number of weekly cases by spring of 96 was down 100. This cause delayment is new, it's quite frightening, and it cannot be easily destroyed. The spongiform agent does not occur uniformly in all tissue. As you would expect, it is concentrated in the nerve structure, and in consequence, the brain, spinal cord were main targets. The small risk of infection is believed to exist in pancreas, lung, and the adrenal gland. And the tissues believed to be virtually certain not to spread it include milk and muscle. The muscle bit's important because it does suggest that whole, high-quality red meat does not transmit BSE. What is worrying is the things that you normally would use to get rid of an infection, which cannot get rid of BSE. None of the alcohol structures, nor does anything else. Formalin preserves it, it does not inactivate it. Glutaraldehyde and hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is a vicious molecule for the nature of the protein, has no effect at all. The phenolics don't. Carbonic acid doesn't. Nor do the iron. It's quite remarkable to realize that the only disinfectant agent that has the ability to remove the infectivity of these spongiform agents is virtually neat hypochlorite bleach. That is the only way in which you can get it off. If you handle specimens on the bench, there's neat hypochlorite bleach, wiped over, allowed to soak for half an hour, and then washed out. That will probably get rid of it. It is not influenced by cooking. It laughs at the autoclave. It spits it out for breakfast. It has no fear whatever of being roasted. So when you imagine that carcasses are piled up and gasoline is poured on them and they're burned away surrounded by kindling and straw, that's fine, simply because the infected agent straight into the air. It is not killed by being buried or any of the normal things in which you would hope to get rid of the disease. This is important because some slaughterhouses have been criticized by the authorities because of the fact that they have been spreading the waste from the slaughterhouse on the ground. And they say we can do it legally because it's been through all the processes which are legally required to get rid of all pathogens. And that's true, and it's just that those processes have no effect on the agent of BSE. There are all sorts of rumours in Britain about the kinds of cattle which don't get it. It's widely being said, we only serve the best Scottish Aberdeen Angus beef, as though in some way that is immune from the disease. No, it's 1,300 cases in Angus. The overwhelming number is in the Frisian Holstein, 134,700. But do notice that there are a couple of nils, the Dexter, the Kerry, and the Irish Moorland. They are all Bronze Age cattle. They date back 5,000 or 10,000 years. They are primitive, early, semi-wild cattle. None of them are cultured. Now we don't know why that is, but the belief is that it may may be that they have an innate ability to resist this. Nobody as yet knows whether that is the case. The cost of total slaughter would be over $4 billion. For that reason, a slaughter policy, an overall slaughter policy, has not been recommended. But the disease has spread from cattle to other forms of animals. And that is something which causes a lot of perplexity. Zoo animals in the late 1980s went down with it in quite large numbers. In Bristol in 1990, a cat in Bristol, a cat suddenly developed spongy-borne symptoms and turned out to have feline spongy-borne encephalopathy. Got it from canned beef cattle. Other members of the cat tribe were also fed the same stuff, including lions, tigers, and ocelots, and pumas and cheetahs. Many of those also developed feline spongy-borne encephalopathy, a disease new to science. Interestingly, although lions and tigers have been fed the same product, none of them ever got ill. So they may have a certain specific resistance to that cause. To see these magnificent beasts being laid low by something caused by modern agricultural methods is none too pleasing. The reaction of Britain was immediate and very firm. Mr. Major immediately said that we would no longer agree to support European initiatives. And as a result, we used our right of veto in order to prevent a lot of leading bits of new legislation going through the European Parliament. That wasn't a fair thing to do, in my view, because when there had been other outbreaks, the Germans a year or two ago had swine fever, for example, we were very strict. We certainly wouldn't import any of their forms, and we insisted that they bore the costs themselves. The Brits turned around and said, well, in this case, everything is new. After all, they said, we have been told time and time again that there is no risk to the human population, and why should we therefore disbelieve our specialists? I took the trouble to look back at the original words of the original reports, and what I found did not confirm what the government had said. Sir Richard Southwood, most eminent zoologist, retired. In his report, which was published in February 1989, it was written in 1988, that's only within 2 years of the disease being recognized, he said, with the long incubation period, it may be a decade or more before particular reassurance is given. He said, because the possibility that BSE may be transmitted orally cannot be entirely ruled out, it's important that this material represents the good trend. He said, it is a reasonable assumption that, were BSE to be transmitted, the clinical disorder would closely resemble Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. He said, from the present evidence, it is most unlikely that BSE will have any implications for human health. And ended by saying, concerned at the remote chance that this new infection could be transmitted orally to man, we recommend the destruction of the cattle carcass. Of that technical report, which was never really available to the public, the only sentence the government ever promoted was, from the present evidence, it is most unlikely that BSE will have any implications for human health. And on the basis of that reassurance, government policy proceeded. The sentence following that was never quoted publicly at all. Nevertheless, if our assessments of these likelihoods are incorrect, the implications would be extremely serious. In September 1994, Sir David Tyrrell published a report. He'd been the director of the Common Cold Research Centre in Salisbury, Wiltshire. And he actually said, as a disclaimer in the beginning of his report, that we do not comment on policy. That plainly is what they've been told by the government. Policy is not appropriate to this committee. But they couldn't help but point out that control measures are necessary for public health because the BSE agent may be a human pathogen. Human transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, as there were fears that meat products of BSE infected cattle might cause cases of CJD in humans. He then said it is too early to draw any conclusions because the incubation period in Kuru, for example, can exceed 30 years. Let's look at the work of Stan Frusner of Los Angeles, who wrote a major book on the molecular biology of the prion diseases. Prions are these proteins which form around nerve cells and which grow in angular and strangely twisted configuration and cause evacuation of spongiform. This was the first book to be published on their molecular biology. And Stan Frusner, who coined the term prion, it means protease resistant infectious protein. Can you imagine a protein which is resistant to protease? Sounds like a contradiction. Yeah? And he said, concern has been raised that the inclusion of BSE infected humans may result in the transmission of BSE to humans. He said, it remains to be seen if the dietary exposure to bovine prion will result in transmission to humans. How can anybody say that there was never any thought in anyone's mind that it might happen? Indeed, when the cases were diagnosed late last year and early this, it's because we were specifically looking for them. We've been told to look for them by the government. Well, there were many meetings, and an Institute of Biology meeting, I'm a member of the council of that institute, and the new president had just come back from a meeting of the Royal Society, and he said, he read an article I'd written on the subject in the London Evening Newspaper, Evening Standard. He said, nice article. I wonder though, he said, where people do go to find out about BSE. If you're a concerned parent, where do you go for information? And I realized that all you actually had was scare stories and unbalanced opinions in the newspapers. You could read Stan Frusner's book, which you needed a higher degree of molecular biology to understand any of it. You could read Salford's report, it was a limited print run, was now out of print, and wasn't written in what normal people would consider English. And it occurred to me that it might be a neat idea to write a book on BSE and put the facts in front of the public. And therefore I approached Corby Books on Transworld, one of the biggest paperback houses in Britain. And I spoke to their editor-in-chief. They published the paperback edition of my Cult of the Expert. I said to Patrick Jansen Smith, what about the book on BSE then? And he said, oh, I wish we were doing one. I wish it was coming out now. Wouldn't it be popular? And I said, no, you'd be sending it to be pulped and recycled. And he said, why? And I said, because your book would say there is no risk to humans. That has been the received view. And it's only in the last few days that we've heard humans have actually been dying after all. And he said, oh my God, you're right. Thank heavens we didn't do it. So I said, but we could do an instant book, couldn't we? And he said, how instant? And I said, within a month. And he said, okay. So I actually faxed him a 12-page proposal that night. The following day, they wrote out their commission check. Don't ever believe it if publishers say that they can't expedite things in confidential account. Don't ever believe it if they tell you that it takes a year to write a book and another year to come. However, it was all agreed, and we had our lunch, and we discussed it all, and mapped it all out. And I said that it would be done by the end of April. It was only when I got home, and I consulted my master's diary, that I discovered that April was full, except for the first week. And therefore, my wife said to me, well, you'll just have to bloody well get on with it then, won't you? And the 205 pages of this 53,000 word book were written in 6.5 days. That is not a boast, it is a warning. Don't any of you, no matter how exuberant, no matter how full of bravado you may be, as I was at that time, don't ever even consider it. It completely did my head in. I went to bed one night with the inside of my head sounding like an electrical generator, and I lay in my bed twitching for a few hours before I got up, unwashed, unshowered, unshaven, staggered downstairs and carried on. It was not good. However, the response to the book was quite extraordinary. You saw some cuttings today from laboratory and other scientific publications. And the moment that the news of the book's existence came out, the press were quickly onto it. When the book came out, I pointed out that the symptoms of this new disease, which they were all calling a new form of CJD, I said, well, it actually isn't much like CJD. The age group, the symptomatology, the duration, is not like CJD at all. It is, in fact, like Kuru. And what we've actually got, I said, is an outbreak of Kuru in the West. Not spread by cannabis, thank God, whatever the young do, and they do have some appalling habits, eating hamburgers being just one of them, but they don't as yet go in for cannibalism. But of course, as soon as the news hit, it created the most enormous storm. And I found myself completely up to the eyes in a mass of media reaction. Now, the reasons for saying that were these. If you look at sections, histological sections of this stuff, then you sometimes see parts of amyloid which form within the brain. And you sometimes see them in CJD, so I'm told. I've never seen a CJD section within it, but you usually get them in DSE, in HSE, human spongiform encephalopathy, like that, and they're common in so Kuru. There are spikes, characteristic EEC spikes, which you find in CJD. They never occur in the new disease, and they never occur in Kuru. CJD, the victims are usually 50 or more. In Kuru, they're always 50 or less, 30, 34. And the same is true in the new disease. The first presentation of CJD is dementia and memory loss, but it's ataxia and problems with the feet, which most frequently occur in Kuru. And a couple of the young victims of the new disease also said they had pain in their feet. Also, the disease is a quick killer in CJD, less than a year, but they linger on for more than a year in HSC and in Kuru. Now, all of these were diagnostic, and possibly the most upsetting aspect is that Kuru, which means trembling in the language of Papua New Guinea, is not known by that name amongst the natives. That's what it's called by Westerners who speak the language. They call it the smiling sickness, because the patients die with a fix and haunting grin. And the videos of the young victims who died in Britain also have this euphoric, staring, haunting smile as they're in the last stage of the disease. Now, you'll be glad to know that when the book appeared, the microscope as the symbol of science naturally appeared in at least one of the photographs. We heard about that this morning. The notion that it wasn't CJD, but was Kuru, you'll be glad to know was moderately and very sort of courteously handled by the media, who were obviously keen not to cause them any problems. There were talks of startling discoveries. A few of the newspapers did rather sweetly wrestle with the fact that what one was trying to get across was the facts of the matter. Now, interestingly, I did a TV program, and at the time, I'm afraid I lacked business sense. At the time, I never thought of it. Last winter, with a couple of great controversialists, and I actually said, the public don't want reassurance. That patronizes them, and it also makes them feel that in some way there's something to be worried about. And the public wants the facts. And there was a storm of applause. And I should at that time, of course, have thought to myself, well, let's do a book on the facts about PSC. importantly, I think, highlighted the fact, and to me it was the important point, the government had been laundering scientific truth. They had been presented with the facts from the microbiological lobby, and they had deliberately concealed it from the public. We've had fat, we've had cholesterol, we've had salt in the diet, we've had smoking, we've had alcohol. When any of these things have been put before people in terms of epidemiology, the facts have been presented to the public, and the public have been left to make up their own. Not here. Here, uniquely, the government decided to launder the facts and to keep the truth away. I actually did an article about it. Daisy was the first cow who actually ever appeared on TV in a much repeated video, staggering about and looking most distressed. The government involvement was picked up by a large number of people. Others just seem to treat it in the most extraordinary way. I never quite understand how some editors work. Indeed, there was one quite delicious pun, which I must admit I don't really approve of, because although it's a fairly childish pun, but it just isn't a subject that makes one laugh. But they decided to call it complete and utter madness. The book, of course, was being flogged off by everybody on all sides. And of course, then when there were later discussions, the existence of the book was still being referred to in other areas as well. And then the shit hit the fan. One of those newspaper articles misquoted what I said. I had said how the president of the Institute of Biology had been very supportive of helping in writing books, as Dicky Huntamer. They also knew that I had criticised the president of the Royal Society because they had published a document on the SE which was filled with silly mistakes. When the article came out, cringe, it said that I had the wholehearted cooperation of the president of the Royal Society, which I hadn't. He had a spat with me. And I thought he was going to write a little note and say, wrong president, sorry, but he didn't. He launched right into it. And we had this enormous great exchange of letters from no less a person than, not yet, no less a person than Sir Aaron Klug, Order of Merit, PRS, or much better than FRS, because it's what you get from the president. And he wrote this great long letter. He also then quoted the letter that he'd written to me. I think it's quite an achievement to get a book on BSE started and published in such a short time. That's the good news. However, and there followed all the bad news, I do not accept the Royal Society statement contains a large number of errors. So then what they did, they then published my actual critique. And my critique was, I think, probably perfectly reasoned and normal. I simply pointed out that a number of things they'd said in their reports were actually wrong. They had said in their official report that many people will look to the Royal Society for guidance. Well, I said they won't find it there. The human form of spongiform encephalopathy is CJD, they say. But we already know there are several others. The infectious agents are prions. That is a theory. And I'm going to discuss the causative agents and what it might be in my talk later in the week. It's a theory. It is not proven. They said the SE was first seen in 1989. There have been lots of reports since published to say that occasional sporadic cases have been seen in previous decades. And so I'm afraid I had to write and refute what he said. Well, now, the following Wednesday was the annual Conversazione at Burlington House, the Linnaean Society, where I'm also a council member, and I was therefore one of the hosts. And below me now, one of our principal guests was another man guest. Guessed it, Sir R and Kuru, presidents of the Royal Society. We'd never met. I've known all of the presidents since the 70s. In fact, it was Sir Andrew Huxley who was so kind as to give me full access to the Leeuwenhoek specimens, which I've more than once recounted to you here over the years. And I was quite keen to have a chance to meet Kuru. Not like this, I wasn't. I said to Jan, my God, I said, that white-haired dwarfish little chap over there, isn't that Cluggy? She said, I think it is. I said, merciful heavens, and I didn't even wear my boxing gloves. I was very, very prepared for trouble. So I went across and loomed over this political science chatty, and I said, Professor Kuru, he said, yes. And I said, we haven't met, and the name is Paul. And I waited. Well, I mean, you know, we could open a book, couldn't we, really? And I said, I'm sorry about it. Oh, my dear boy, he said, don't even think of it. He said, that's just diplomatic doodahs. He said, I had to stick up to the Royal Society. I knew it was job the president. I thought, well, somebody's got to. Now tell me, this lady thing, I've got a replica of mine, and there's something I've been longing to ask. Now, can any of you imagine the sense of relief? I said, oh, well, yes. I said, another sherry, sir. And an hour later, Jan was beckoning to me and saying, meaning it's time we went to the pub. But within an hour, we were very friendly. Since then, we exchanged a couple of very cordial and very friendly letters. And so what looked as though it was going to be a massive explosion turned out, in fact, to be perfectly pleasant and no trouble at all. Now, let me end just by saying what I truly think we've actually got to do if, in future, we're going to come to terms with diseases like this. First of all, we've got to aim to banish the spongiform disease. We've tolerated them too long. And the whole notion of, well, they're not likely to kill people, and if they do, they won't kill too many, is not tolerable. Where human health is concerned, if we have a new disease, we really have to knuckle down and to exterminate it. We've got to restore the openness in science and medicine. These days, funding agencies tend to say, we gave you the grant, we own the results. And people are simply told that they cannot, they're not allowed to publish their results. They're not allowed to give accounts of the progress of their research because it's funded and the funding agency owns the intellectual property. That's rubbish. We, the public, provide the money for the funding agencies, and in my view, in science, which is merely truth, that truth belongs in the public domain and should not be regarded as a proprietorial piece of goods. We've got to have truth restored to science. We do need to understand that although there's been much emphasis in your country for many years and in mine for our cure, emphasis on the notion of wealth creation, that what matters in society is not wealth creation. What matters is fact creation, understanding creation, knowledge creation. And that is not related to money. The great discoveries in science have usually been made by people driven by rivalry, by ambition, by an unquenchable urge to nudge new knowledge from a very unwilling and recalcitrant universe, not because they're going to make a bomb out of it. People do research for the fun of it, and the whole business of results-related research, of market-driven research, must, in my view, go. Feed in agriculture must be germ-free. We tolerate large amounts of salmonella in chickens because you say, well, it mostly gets killed in cooking and what the heck. But you note those cases you have of new strains of E. coli in American hamburger meat, which can kill and maim because they are antibiotic resistant. We have got to have standards where germs are not put into the public domain, are not spread into the environment. And the notion of it's cheaper to let them go out because not too many get ill is really not permissible. I mean, we've got a new class of diseases here, and we cannot tolerate that in the future. Pure research, finally, has got to have high, regular, and properly apportioned funding. We all know, I mean, we were watching Skip do his fine presentation with a bit of scotch tape holding the camera on top. We all know how Walter loves to jump up and throw away all that SEM and fractal rubbish and show what you can do with a couple of bits cut from a discarded pair of sunglasses. We know real science is not expensive. The great discoveries were made on a shoestring. It's astronomers and subatomic particle physicists who love to build multi-spillion-pound edifices that they can live in and eat their sandwiches in and boast to their friends about and discover next to nothing of any real significance. Real science is cheap. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And the reason I've always worked independently is because of the fun of picking up a new project and actually running it. That's what I like more than anything. But I did, in the book, and this is my author's copy, which I mentioned there next to the author, I did draw out of all of this appalling story a kind of positive message, and I want to leave you this evening. There are many diseases. We have now diseases like Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, which we accept in society. We look back to the days of the Black Death plague and we think, how did people live with cholera and typhoid and plagues all around? How did they ever tolerate it? But we all do tolerate it. One of our great friends here, dear Shirley, wrote to me one of the most shattering letters I've ever had in December. She said, I was forgetful at last into my throat. I've been to the doctor and he tells me that I have early Alzheimer's. Now, I've had letters like that from husbands and wives of patients. I've never had a letter like that from a sufferer myself. It's a wounding and a moving thing. And yet I suddenly thought of all the other people I knew who had Alzheimer's. And I know that we say, Fred's got Alzheimer's. Oh, terrible. That's how it was in the 1600s when people died in the plague. We're surrounded by these plagues. And we accept them with just as much equanimity as they ever did in the past. It's an important lesson that we realise that. But Alzheimer's, like DSE, like Kuru and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, forms little fibrils in the brain. Huntington's disease, like Kuru and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Straight, forms vacuoles, little spaces, fluid-filled, circular spherical holes in the brain tissue. I believe that as we lived in the 1800s through the great era of bacterial diseases, and in the 1900s in our present 20th century through the great era of virus diseases, that the challenge from the new millennium just may be the great degenerative diseases of the brain. They too may be a spectrum. And if any good comes out of it, it just may be that the appalling mess which the British government made of its proper handling of this amazing new condition just may be that that single fact will act as a trigger for research. At the moment, youngsters are all going into genetics. They all want to decode the human genome. Well, that doesn't enable us to do anything. Not only that, it is merely a red code for different bits of discrete individuals. Once you know what causes something, it increases your knowledge base, but it doesn't give you the immediate answer which the public are so often led to believe that we're going to have. And yet it's the genetics everybody wants to go. The great promise of molecular biology, which I documented at length in a book 20 years ago, has just not happened as yet. Our ancient forebears created bananas and pineapples and oranges and apples and sheep and goats and stuff. All we've done is to make something like a pink petunia or a giant cabbage. It's extraordinary the extent to which our knowledge of genetics has not had the major impact that we thought it was going to have. Now I believe that there is here a new spectrum of diseases which is not fashionable. Alzheimer's is what old forgetful people get. Who cares about Alzheimer's? That's the kind of attitude you find in young scientists. And if there is any good that comes to it, perhaps this new frightening disease, possibly because it affects the young, will act as a stimulus and may give us insights into disparate diseases that in future we will recognize as belonging to one class. If there is, yes, there was. Please.
Is full mad calories related to BSE?
No. It's, well, good question. It's been actually called CJD, a new form of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I believe that it's actually Kuru. I don't think it's got anything to do with it, but they haven't actually given much thought to the name. And I called it in my book human spongiform encephalopathy, like bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And I still think that HSE is a more honest name than CJD.
Because if BSE was the same thing, there has been at least one case.
Well, you have got cases of other spongiform diseases in the United States. You have mule deer have a wasting disease of deer is a spongiform disease. You also have mink encephalopathy, which is also a spongiform disease. And so there are spongiform diseases in wild animals in the United States. And if it can transfer to sheep, to cows, it may. And if it can transfer from cows to humans, it may. So it's quite possible that you may yet see it over here. I think it's purely by luck and not by judgment. That's enough for me. To get it over here. Was there another terribly quick question? Yes. Yes, some of the cluster have yet to be identified because they're not dead yet, and you can only do the identification on histology. But it is spooky, very rare, that there is believed to be a cluster of 4 or 5 cases. The highest geographical density anywhere in Britain is around Ashford in Kent, which is where the first case was. My guess is that it's related to some other factor. There is also one of these major slaughterhouses which has been spreading its waste on fields for some time. It may be a decent drink, who knows? But my guess is that the fact that it's Ashford is, in the end, that it has a certain dreadful poetry. The first case ever was seen by colleagues over a nice spring day in Ashford, and now the greatest concentration of cases is exactly the same. Yes, it is. Irradiation does not affect the infected rate. You can irradiate the stuff with exactly the same gamma ray pulse as you do normal food that's going to be preserved, or specimens, or chemical instruments that are going to be disinfected. And they are perfectly cleaned out by the gamma radiation. It doesn't touch the infectious end of the instrument. That's the question.
Have they not been affected by meat?
No. It is a protein which is not affected by protease. It is not denatured by anything other than many hundreds of degrees. So how do we do that? So everybody has these questions on their mind. I mean, it really is, totally mysterious territory. And those questions are in everybody's minds, and there ain't no answer. The reason we believe it's targeted is because the rendering down of waste carcasses was suddenly done more leniently than had been the case. I mentioned earlier that fat was an important industrial byproduct until about 1982, when the price came down. And that was the time of the Thatcher years when profit and money was all mattered a little bit like certain forces in the United States right now. And the industry said, can we skate around these regulations? And instead of heating it to 140 Celsius, only heat to say 100. And instead of using solvents to get out the fat, just evaporate. And so, in fact, feed was suddenly being heated to about boiling point for about 10 minutes, and then pelleted up and sold. Now, one way in which you could get rid of the carcasses, don't laugh, it's true, would be to reinstate high temperature rendering, to pellet the remains of the carcass, burn them in power stations to generate electricity. Because they're still decaying. And at the moment, that kind of that sort of incineration will kill it. You know, if you burn it, it'll kill it. But if you merely heat it up to boiling point, which happens with just a general bonfire, then you won't. The most likely cause, and I'm sure you all know, it is believed that the scrapie infected sheep carcass that was eaten by cattle, and that caused the BSE in cattle. In favour of that is the fact that sheep carcasses were widely used. I don't actually subscribe to that theory. I think it's more likely to come from an infected cattle carcass. I guess that if we have 1 case in a million of BSE, of CJD, could be there's always been 1 case in a million of BSE in cattle. But because they don't eat each other, what we do in the West, it doesn't spread. It may be that it was an infected cattle carcass going through and being rendered down that put the stuff in the domain for all the other cattle to be able to consume it from there and went to land. But it is true that if you render at high temperatures, you do destroy the infectivity. But it's got to be hundreds of degrees Celsius, not just 125. The carcasses are now, the slaughterhouses are running at full rate, and we have 5 major incineration plants, which are running 24 hours a day to incinerate, to red heat, to incinerate the remains.
I'm very sorry to have to stand up and say that and apologize to Brian for several things, mainly that this evening has been cut short by the program committee who insisted there's another meeting here.
That's true.
It started 20 minutes ago. I not only apologize to Brian, but I want to say that that is a fantastic story. I have not heard anything